This is actually a very momentous time, I think, this particular topic, and the evolution of the Nature Conservancy and how we're working with Indigenous peoples and where it's fitting in our institutional structure. So you'll be hearing from me today talking about where we are at this point in time. And it's certainly a moment of growth, great change, and I'm quite excited about the future and what lies ahead. And this discussion, I'm hoping, will actually engender a bigger discussion with me going forward and having more engagement from you all, because there's an opportunity here for each and every one of you. I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about some of the earlier approaches to conservation, and I think TNC, like many other conservation organizations, could be accused of this. So I wanted to be out there and talk about what this new ethic ought to mean, and what TNC is doing to commit to a new ethic. Early approaches were exclusionary. It was often based on dispossession and dislocation, parting off land away from Indigenous peoples and from people in general. The idea of historical landscapes were seen as pristine wilderness, that as Peggy mentioned, empty vast lands where people weren't there, and that was obviously a very big problem. Conservation was done from people and away from people. So game reserves, wilderness areas, and national parks were something to be protected from people's influence. People were oftentimes seen as a threat to nature, and we still see that from time to time in some of the work that's done in the name of conservation. And certainly, I think to a very large extent, and it's quite difficult, conservation is often rights blind. And that's been, I think, the biggest challenge, being in the conservation world and having come from the Indigenous rights world. So this is a very interesting space for me to be in. Just looking back at some of Indigenous peoples and what they have said about conservation, in the declaration of a meeting of 200 delegates at a meeting in Vancouver of the International Forum on Indigenous Matters, they said activities of conservation organizations now represent the biggest threat to the integrity of Indigenous lands. I remember reading that and thinking to myself, that's true. We talk a lot about extractive industries and mining, and the UN Special Rapporteur has been focused on that in the last year. He's going to continue his work on that. But I think the need to tackle what conservation organization is doing that can actually impede the well-being of Indigenous peoples must be addressed head-on. And this particular discussion is something that I find as an innovative opportunity just to begin that process. There was a side leader who once said, "We are enemies of conservation." He was referring to how he felt he was being seen, but yet we cannot accomplish conservation without us. And now when we contrast that with the UN Declaration, the various articles, 3, 10, and the ones I mentioned, that talk about the right to participation, the right to free, prior, and informed consent, the right to no forced dislocation or removal from Indigenous lands, and I can go on and on and on, we're seeing the emergence of new standards, rights, and procedures that allow for a much more conclusive space. And this is what TNC is trying to do to create that space within our organization to move towards this new ethic. So, what does this new ethic mean? Well, at the Nature Conservancy, many of our programs we've been working with Indigenous peoples for well over 40 years, but we didn't have an Indigenous program. There wasn't a structure. It was on-the-ground relationships with people that we've had for many, many decades. I started my job as the Director of Indigenous and Communal Conservation in January. And having started recently, I've traveled quite a bit, and I've spoken to many Indigenous people who say, yes, my grandfather was working with members of your staff years ago. So we have these on-the-ground relationships, but they didn't have a framework to guide, as Kristen was mentioning, to guide the work that we were doing. And at times, this led to outcomes that were not favorable, to put it mildly. So towards this new ethic, successful conservation begins and ends with people. And many of our conservation programs in Canada, Africa, Amazon say this, and now there's an opportunity to move forward and to implement what this really means in practice. what is TNC doing? Well, in 2010, our board approved the CIHR, Conservation Initiative on Human Rights. But since then, we haven't been moving towards implementation of it. And there's many reasons for that. So in 2011, the Indigenous and communal conservation was created as a global priority, which means we have 12 global priorities. TNC has put this as a main focal area to organize the program for. This has just been recently established. So now it's up to me as the global director to work with my other counterparts at the global level as well as the field programs to start putting flesh to this on this community practice. And this is why I say this is a wonderful opportunity and a very interesting time in the history of Nature Conservancy. In this year and over the next year, we're going to be reviewing and developing our current practices, our gaps, taking a hard look at our safeguards, our internal awareness and understanding, where we're at and how we think about rights-based approaches, and Indigenous peoples, how we understand what the role of treaties and other construction agreements mean, and what that means for our work. And this is beginning to happen. So we're going to be engaging in this broad-based review over the next year. Over the next year as well, I'll be beginning what's known as a global priority business planning process, which means I'm going to be working with my colleagues and a team of people to start figuring out where we're going to be working and having a focal area with Indigenous and communal conservation. We're working with Indigenous peoples all over the world, but where my particular attention will be developed over the next year. And we're also moving conservation beyond ecological outcomes. So for us, we're going to be using, and we are using multidisciplinary approaches in social science. And I'll be explaining more about what that means. One of the biggest things that we'll be doing is the internal education on Indigenous rights and international standards and norms. And I think this is such an important opportunity for the Nature Conservancy to really grow. So I'm looking at the creation of whether it's university level courses and education programs for all of our 4,000 staff across the globe, and bring in Indigenous speakers and human rights practitioners to come in and talk to us and share your knowledge so that we can learn from you all. We're also looking at how we broaden conservation outcomes to include social outcomes. So for example, the CEESP program coming out of Canada, which is the supporting empowerment of Aboriginal stewards, is an opportunity for fellowships of the youth to be participating. We recognize the importance of the youth and as leaders and stewards of conservation. Embedded in that is that respect for elders, recognizing the wisdom of elders and their knowledge and creating a space for them in the work that we're doing. Going forward, we're looking more and more on how we use our science, which kind of science, how we incorporate Indigenous traditional knowledge, how we measure and evaluate our outcomes. This is a key component of the work that we'll be doing, and we're working closely with our science staff to ensure that how we're measuring and how we're evaluating will include Indigenous participation and feedback. And of course, we're going to be continuing our participation in the CIHR. And over time, and as we've been doing over the last 40 to 50 years, we're going to be investing in communities, building long-term investments and places and people. And that's what we've been doing for the last multiple decades, and that's what we're going to be investing in going forward. So this is some of my own thinking of where the Indigenous and communal conservation program is heading. So I've thought about it and tried to capture an approach, and I termed it the We Cares approach. And as you can see, it stands for the well-being and empowerment through conservation action and rights and environmental sustainability. And essentially, it's about mainstreaming a human rights-based approach to conservation, implementing the CIHR, committing to the highest international standards as outlined in the Human Declaration, the highest standards that we see in regional instruments, participating in Indigenous rights processes to support the work that Indigenous peoples are doing, and ensuring that there is an open dialogue between our organization and Indigenous peoples over the concerns they have about potentially the work that we're doing and what's happening on the ground and what we can do to help. strategy in brief, which I've been speaking to our executive leadership, and there's, I guess, many have told me that they're quite excited about this vision for where we're going. It's just that the idea is tied to the inextricable link between human rights and the rights to a safe environment. I myself was extremely happy to see the independent expert being created in January as a result of a resolution by the Human Rights Council, which passed a resolution to create this new independent mechanism. His name is John Knox. And as a result, I think this puts an onus on conservation organizations to act in good faith and in a responsible way. So I think, as I mentioned there, we have a role and a duty to ensure that what we do and how we do it is in line with best human rights practices and policies. The strategy is also based on aligning with Indigenous priorities. And I've been working in this space now for a couple of decades and listening to Indigenous peoples and listening what are their needs and what are their priorities and structuring our work to ensure that we can provide effective conservation solutions with them and develop value with them together. I hear that needs a statement that we need to work alongside Indigenous people, so that's where we're headed. So essentially then, where I wanted to end is talking about what this new ethic ought to mean. For me, it's based on the idea of mutual respect, reciprocal dialogue, intercultural dialogue, inclusive participation, openness and understanding, being ready to hear very hard things, being ready to hear that in the past things weren't done right, and being prepared to move in this new direction going forward. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the discussion.
And we do have to end on time, which means we have just 20 minutes left for discussion. So can I ask all the speakers to come up to the front? And one, I'm going to ask you if you'll take over facilitation, but perhaps people in the audience, if we can be focused about this, the idea is what kind of direction can we be and how would we like to see things changed? And the more specific we can be, I think the better. So if anyone who's been listening to these presentations has some ideas, then this might be the time to jump up. Microphone? Yeah. Great.
Gracias. culturas y el tema de la tierra en los casos mencionados tienen un carácter de tenencia plena.
Yeah, I just want to remind you that our the content of this workshop is the relationship between conservation organizations and indigenous people. So that's our focus.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm interested in the theme of evaluation and review of practice. Usually reviews and evaluations are carried out by professionals who belong to conservation organizations or members of their networks. I think there's a real opportunity to turn the whole review process around. And by that I mean given the opportunity and the resources and the mandate to Indigenous people's representatives to review and evaluate the work of conservation organizations and how well conservation organizations are implementing some of the best practice which has appeared in the literature of conservation organizations. And I think that might be very helpful for the champions of change within conservation organizations who might need more support to push their organizations to transform and shift organizational cultures, professional practice in ways that are compatible with human rights. I'll just, if you don't mind, say, with several of us facilitated a process whereby West African farmers did a review of public research in agriculture. I should say it had never happened before, and the insights were fascinating. They really provided a good reality check. And farmers, men and women, were reviewing the theory, the practice, the intentions, the impacts of research, public research, through their cultural lens, using their own criteria and coming up with recommendations that were never heard before. I think we would have very interesting insights if such processes happen regularly. And conservation organizations, I understand that Conservation International, etc., were regularly reviewed, and that there were resources available for this to happen for each continent every 2 or 3 years.
Thank you. We'll have to
Beth and Martin from our channel New Zealand. Kia ora. Thank you, Anna, for your eloquent contribution and greetings to everybody. This suggestion is made with respect to all the work that's being done to create a framework of a new conservation ethic based on the proposal is that this may not be the full implementation framework, and that if we consider, which I think you hinted at, that the addition of rights and responsibilities is a more complete framework, because that refers to the implementation side of rights. And when some of you mentioned accountability and forms of governance, I would just propose that we consider. IUCN does have the Earth Charter as a ethical framework as a guiding work. It hasn't been, I've been meeting with some of the Earth Charter people, and it perhaps still needs a lot of implementation, and this might be an important opportunity because it's a way of ensuring the recognition of common heritage and of transboundary issues. and interdependence, and it addresses the governance side, you know, where rights are being implemented. So I'm putting that up for consideration of perhaps a more complete framework for this work.
Thank you. Next one, please.